So shutter speed is one of the three things that affect exposure in your image taking, but also shutter speed is a very valuable creative tool. We're going to take a look here at some of the ways that you can control shutter speed and what that does to affect exposure, but also in terms of helping you make better creative choices when you're determining what method you're going to use to take pictures.
To demonstrate this, I've got a metronome set up. I've got the familiar computer/camera set up where I've got the computer remote controlling the camera, but once again, there's nothing here on the software that's anything special. Everything that I'm doing here on the computer is something that you would be doing right in your handheld SLR camera. So, first off, shutter speed, creatively speaking, is designed to either freeze or to blur motion. And so I want to demonstrate that with a few different settings here. Most photographers, when they're concerned about shutter speed, are going to choose shutter priority mode on their camera. However, you could use manual control as well. That would allow you to set your own shutter speed as well as your own aperture. But for shutter priority setting, you are going to choose the shutter yourself, and the camera, based upon the internal metering system, is going to determine the ISO and the f-stop. Right now, I've got a metronome set up that I want to start. I'm going to start this off slow with about 48 beats per minute. And over here on the camera end, I'm going to start this off on the low end as well by going with a low shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. Here we go. Let's trip the shutter and see what happens. And there we go. All right, so what we're looking at here is just a nice blurred metronome arm that gives a sense of motion, gives a sense of energy, gives a sense of livelihood to what is moving on the screen, on the image.
Shutter speed can be attained by using shutter priority mode and also through full manual mode. So when you use full manual mode to determine exposure, you oftentimes have to rely on the LCD to tell you if your image is overexposed or underexposed, and then adjust either your aperture or shutter based upon these settings, or perhaps your ISO as well, and then arrive to the correct exposure given a certain lighting situation. So in other words, every time you change lighting situations, if you go indoors and then go outdoors, you're going to have to make some adjustments in full manual mode yourself to compensate for the difference in lighting. Shutter priority mode is an easier method to work with because when you use shutter priority mode, you determine the shutter yourself, which allows you to control the creative side of shutter speed, while the camera then uses the internal metering system to decide what aperture and, depending on your settings, what ISO to use as well, and then gives you the correct exposure, hopefully based upon the light meter. Using shutter priority mode is different according to the manufacturer of your camera. So for example, here on the left, you can see the Nikon method of entering into shutter priority mode is to switch it over to the S. S standing for shutter. While as Canon, it's a little bit harder to figure out. It's the TV, which is actually shutter priority mode. And different manufacturers will have different shortcuts for letting you know you're going into shutter priority mode.
So now I'll speed this metronome up to a much faster pace. We'll take this to roughly 192 beats per minute. Now with a much faster subject, it's going to be harder for us to freeze the action of the metronome. Let's start off at the slow end again. I'm going to go back down to an extreme. Let's try 1/10 of a second. See what we get here. And you can see this one is so blurred due to the fast action here that we really can't even see the metronome at all. It's almost, the arm has completely disappeared basically in the shot. You see a little bit of gray area there at the base. So that gives you an idea of how much we just blurred this. Let's go ahead and increase this back to 1/125th of a second. Take a quick shot there and see what happens. And now we're seeing a little bit more of the arm come into focus, but still very, very, very much blurred. And this is the kind of experimentation you want to think about when you're doing your first shutter speed trials, because different objects moving at different speeds are going to give you very different results at different shutter speeds. And you got to keep that in mind. Shooting a bird in motion, flying, and blurring the action of the wings there is going to be different than shooting a jogger jogging or a sprinter sprinting.
Shutter priority mode basically allows you to enter a shutter speed. Here's an image of an older shutter on an older camera. What happens is the shutter gets tripped according to the speed setting that you give it. And here you can see the internal workings of the camera. There's a mirror there that line is bouncing off of, and that mirror is retractable. When that mirror goes up, then the light is allowed to hit the shutter plane behind it, go through the shutter plane behind it, and then eventually to the image sensor behind the shutter. And it's the different speeds that you can set that allow different amounts of light to hit your focal plane. So in the older film cameras, that was when the light hit the actual film. Nowadays, it's when the light hits the actual CMOS light sensor and hits the digital chip that is being protected by both your shutter and the aperture. So here you have a reminder of the aperture settings. The aperture is located in the lens, and it's the first gateway that allows light to come through or blocks light. And according to the different sizes of aperture, the different size openings that you use for your aperture, you're going to get more light or less light. Well, similarly, you also have a scale that determines how shutter is going to affect the amount of light that hits your focal plane. And here we've got a chart that reads from 1/30th of a second all the way to 1/4000th of a second. These represent full stops in much the same way the full stops on the aperture that I just showed you a moment ago here are represented. So here we're not going to talk about compensation, that's for another lecture, but the idea is that by giving the user a shorthand method of determining how much more light or less light is coming through, you're able to then get a better idea of what's going on in terms of exposure. So here on this scale, you can see that the faster the shutter speed is set to, the less light is going to hit the sensor. And the smaller numbers on this scale are going to lead to more light hitting the sensor. Well, this is just the most common part of the scale that is used by people shooting handheld in normal lighting situations. But when you start to get into situations where you may want to blur the image more, or you may just need more light because you're in a really dark situation, you might go well below the 1/30th of a second rating. That's just the part of the scale that I'm showing here on this chart, the top end of the scale, so it happens to be. But certainly you can have exposures that go well above 1/30th of a second in terms of exposure time. You can have a 1-second exposure, you can have a 4-second exposure. You can even have, in most cameras, a setting that allows you to hold the shutter open for as long as you decide to keep it open manually. And that's usually indicated by a B for bulb.
All right, at its fastest speed, this metronome arm is going to be a little difficult to freeze, so I'm going to increase my shutter speed up to 1/400th of a second. I'll take an image at that speed. And you'll notice that there's a nice sharp arm here where we got no motion blur whatsoever. The action has been completely frozen at 1/400th of a second. So let's just to try this out, let's go ahead and try a few other settings. I'm going to go down now from 1/400th of a second. Let's decrease this to 1/100th of a second. Let's see what happens. All right, now we've got a little bit of motion blur. Now we've introduced a little bit of blur, and that's going to allow us to give a sense of motion to whatever is moving. You notice we've got a contrast between the numbers on the metronome, which are perfectly sharp and still, versus the arm, which is clearly now given some vitality, given some movement in the frame.
Well, when you actually take pictures controlling shutter speed as opposed to controlling aperture, you're having a creative effect on the image itself. So it's not just a means of getting correct exposure. It's also a means of creatively controlling the amount of blur or sharpness you get in the image. So here's an example of a slow shutter speed and a very fast subject. So this was shot at 1/10 of a second. As a compensation method for exposure, the aperture went all the way down to f/22. So that gives you some idea of how those two are related. And as a result, you get a nice blurred streak there when it comes to photographing these cars going at roughly 50 miles per hour down the road. Here's the same situation with a very different shutter speed. Here now we're at the top of the scale at 1/4 thousandths of a second. Obviously a very fast shutter speed. It's letting very limited amount of light allowing a very limited amount of light to hit the CMOS sensor. And as a result, the aperture has to be wide open to compensate for that. So the aperture is 2.8, whereas in the previous image, it was f/22. So you can see the difference here. It's obviously a much sharper image. We've frozen the vehicles in the shot, especially the vehicle here that's still in motion. Now, it should be noted that the vehicles there in the distance are frozen, yes, but they're already been stopped by the traffic lights. So it's these images here and these vehicles in the foreground that are blurred. Here's another example. Here's a fountain that was taken again at 1/4 thousandths of a second. You notice again the aperture is wide open to compensate for the low amount of light coming through on the shutter. But you'll notice the frozen droplets of water up against that sky. You can really see each individual drop of water. Now here's the same exact situation shot same time of day, same lighting conditions, but with a shutter speed of 1/20th of a second. You notice now the aperture, because of the slow shutter, is all the way down to f/22. So hopefully you're getting some sort of idea of the interplay between these two when it comes to light exposure. But anyway, again, look at the creative effect. Now we've blurred the droplets of water. We have a much more hazy feel there on the water. And this is the kind of look that a lot of people like for waterfalls, for example, to have those kind of streaks of white coming down, and gives you a softer effect. Here's some live animals shot with a 1/4 thousandths of a second shutter speed that, again, freezes the action. These ducks are very frantic and active, feeding on the bottom there of the pond. And then, by contrast here's 1/5 of a second. You can see the soft blurred motion there that indicates to the viewer some sort of action is taking place there and gives a sense of motion rather than static stillness that the other one captures. But again, you'll notice the aperture here is all the way at 32 to compensate for the amount of light coming through. Here's another version of that same situation, same shutter speed, same aperture, but just a slightly different look. Often when you shoot with blurred action, you need to just rely on the fact that it's going to be different every time. And it's very hard to predict the streaks of light that you're going to get, especially when you're first starting to experiment with this. And so I highly recommend you take a large series of images when you're experimenting with slow shutter speed, because you may not get what you want the first go round, and you may have to take a few different shots to get the right action that you want blurred. And it's kind of a hit and miss process. So speaking of blurred action, here's an example of a blurred zoom effect. And what's happening here is I'm actually moving the zoom lens with my hand as I take the picture. So the shutter speed is very slow. Once again, this is 1/4 of a second here. But the difference here is that you notice on the lens it says 70 to 170 millimeters because I'm actually taking the lens from 70 millimeters at the beginning and then zooming in to 170 as the image is taken. And so the shutter is slow enough that when I do that, you get these streaks of light. Looks like they're emanating out of where the duck is in the center of the frame, but in reality it's just the blur effect we get from the light as I zoom in at the same time. So this is basically a zoom blur. and one of the creative things you can do with the slower shutter speed. Again, this is a lot of trial and error, so it usually will take a few times before you get something that you're happy with. Another thing that you can do creatively with shutter speed is to show contrast. And one of the ways that you can do that within the frame is to use a slow shutter like this one, once again, 1/13 of a second, but have the subject, which in this case is a person, remaining still while something else moves in the background. This is often a technique that people use in crowd situations. So the crowd will be blurred because they're moving while your subject is completely still. So in this case, we have the blurred fountain while the subject is still. So just a couple examples of what you can do creatively with shutter speed. But shutter speed is, again, a powerful tool that you don't want to overlook. And oftentimes people just kind of set the shutter for the situation that they think is going to be most appropriate for not blurring the image. So for example, they'll say, okay, well, I've got a focal length of 100 millimeters, so I'll shoot at 1/100th of a second, and that will ensure that in most situations I'm not going to blur the image when I take a picture, since I'm not using a tripod. And that's certainly a good rule to practice when you're trying to get sharp images, but a lot of times people then become afraid of slow shutter, and I don't think that should be the case. You know, get your tripod out, attach your camera to the tripod, and start experimenting with slow shutter speeds, because I think you may have a lot of fun with it.